Welcome to W Report, an independent take on the world's most important events. Today, we are joined by Professor Jeffrey Sachs. We're seeing a wave of escalating crises, wars from Europe to the Middle East, growing talk of conflict with China, and the doomsday clock moving closer to nuclear war. Alongside this, economic warfare, political discontent, especially in Europe, and a lack of real diplomacy. Some, like Steve Bannon, claim World War III has already started. What do you see as the core forces pushing the world in this direction?
Yes, this is indeed a very dangerous time, as I think everyone on the planet
Okay,
understands. The world is disrupted in fundamental ways. In other words, the world is changing dramatically, in some ways potentially for the better, because technology, the possibilities of making positive breakthroughs are very real. In some ways positive because poor countries are catching up, improving living standards in many places, especially in Asia, but also disrupted extraordinarily dangerously, obviously, by the spread of nuclear weapons, by the changing geopolitics, because as the world has gone from first a so-called bipolar world of the U.S. and the Soviet Union between 1945 and 1991 to a supposedly or allegedly unipolar world, at least as declared by the United States after 1991, we clearly are in a multipolar world today, where the United States, China, Russia, and arguably other countries, India, another, and I would say Europe, if it could ever get its act together, but it does not currently have its act together, would be another. Now compete for power, but without norms, without a shared vision. And indeed, I would say in a world in which the West, meaning the US-led world, is rather desperately trying to keep its primacy or its hold on power over China, Russia, and the BRICS countries more generally.
got it.
So that's a lot of disruption. Add in the fact that we have climate disasters everywhere, an inconvenient point that is brushed aside by many, for example, by Trump and others, because it just doesn't fit other narratives, but is extraordinarily real. Even China in Beijing experienced massive loss of life in recent days from extreme flooding. The events in Los Angeles of massive forest fires earlier this year are among the largest measured catastrophes in terms of damages and losses that we've ever seen. This is happening all over the world. So the world is filled with disruption, and at the same time, the quality of leadership in the West is dismal. Donald Trump is an unstable, uh, unpredictable, not merely transactional, but I would say person without any longer-term perspective, uh, leading the United States right now. Europe is clearly without any leadership whatsoever. It's in a state progressively of open collapse politically. Ursula von der Leyen is a disgrace, and we saw this with the most recent so-called trade negotiations between Europe and the United States, where Europe just basically accepted U.S. diktats. And so
Interesting.
with the Western leadership terrible, with Donald Trump filled with the delusions of U.S. power, with the rapid disruptions in technology, environment, in geopolitics, in economics all over the world, with the spread of nuclear weapons, with the local, but not so local, I should say, absolute disasters such as Israel's genocide in Gaza aided and abetted by the United States and Europe. All of this adds up to extraordinary instability and extraordinary danger. You mentioned the doomsday clock. I refer to it very often because it is our most clear and dramatic graphic of the world state of affairs. It purports or aims to measure how close we are to complete global disaster such as nuclear war or nuclear Armageddon. And the clock hand is put by these experts at the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists at a mere 89 seconds to midnight, the closest to midnight or to disaster that the clock has been depicted since it was unveiled in 1947. In other words, we've arrived at this age of AI and advanced technologies and space technology and all this weaponry closer to global suicide than ever before.
Of course, Europe today seems to lack clear direction and leadership. Germany, for instance, is openly debating banning opposition parties, acquiring nuclear weapons, and embracing military Keynesianism, all while offering no real push for peace, even amid war rhetoric toward Russia and silence on the crisis in Palestine. Is this crisis of direction unique to Europe, or is it part of a broader Western pattern similar to what we see in the U.S.?
Well, first, I would say that it's a retrogression in Europe. It's not that Europe has always been so awful in its politics in recent decades. After World War II, which of course was one of the greatest calamities of history,
Yeah,
uh, Europe seemed to take note within Europe, not imposed from the outside, but within Europe, that a different way was needed, and the way would be peace, cooperation, and creating a community, a European community that eventually became a European Union. And Europe stood back up, and not simply as a vassal of the United States. There were leaders in Europe, certainly, who spoke up and said the U.S. is on the wrong track or the right track. The U.S. was broadly an ally under NATO, but Europe was not subservient. There was independent politics, and Germany is a case in point, because Willy Brandt, for example, was a very uh, independent and bold chancellor of West Germany, who said we need a different approach to the East, the Ostpolitik. We need to have a cooperative arrangement with the Soviet Union, not to see ourselves as doomed to war in Europe. And that opened up a new kind of politics that helped to give rise to Mikhail Gorbachev's politics. And I, as a young economist at the time, uh, came to be part of the advisory groups to Mikhail Gorbachev and to Boris Yeltsin and to Leonid Kuchma of Ukraine when it gained its independence in the early 1990s. I visited German leaders in the early 1990s. It seemed that Europe was building a peaceful European home, as Gorbachev had said, from Rotterdam to Vladivostok. In other words, the idea that the old divisions of the Cold War period would end, and Europe and Russia and the former Soviet Union would find peace, would find collective security, and find economic shared prosperity through trade and investment, seemed to be taking shape. I believed it in the early 1990s. I certainly did my best to help it come about. I advised many governments in Eastern Europe, and my main idea there was that they would join this new union, but that the union wasn't to just move the Berlin Wall a few hundred kilometers to the east and exclude Russia, but that this would build a true European home. That was the idea. Perfectly possible. Many European leaders were in favor of it. So it raises the question, Glenn, what went wrong? And in my view, one major thing went wrong, and that is the United States leadership became completely delusional and arrogant, drunk on power, believing its own press releases that the U.S. was now the sole superpower, the most powerful country that ever strode the planet, the new Rome, except surpassing Rome, the country that could do anything that it wants to do. And conjoined with that, Europe fell into line. So those are the two things, in my view, that proved absolutely disastrous from the promise of the early 1990s. In the United States, the neocons took power. And the neocons basically was a philosophy of the CIA, the deep state, and some pseudo-intellectuals, let me call them that, who said, now the U.S. runs the show. And they proudly took on the idea that, yes, the U.S. is the world's policeman. In those words, actually, that used to be a derogatory idea. Oh, U.S. pretends to be the world's policeman. But they said, yes, of course the U.S. is the world's policeman. We are the sole superpower. For a while, many in Europe said, no, 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 no. We don't join you, for example, in the war in Iraq, the U.S. war in Iraq, which was a war of arrogance, a war together with Israel to overthrow a regime for no real reason, but it was phonied up as a war against Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction. It was a disaster in destabilization, in loss of life, and creating chaos in the world, in breaking apart the European common home. But even then, in 2003, there were voices in Europe that said, no, this is not a good idea. Germany and France said, no, we don't side with the United States in this war. That was the last independence of Europe, however, because the neocons, George Bush Jr., who was president then, put the foot down and said, Europe, get into line. By 2008, Europe was subservient to the United States, most dramatically at the Bucharest NATO summit that year in 2008, when NATO said that NATO would expand to Ukraine and to Georgia, which was the predicate, the setup for the war in Ukraine today. And Europe, even in the memoirs of Chancellor Angela Merkel, for one day tried to object. And then after the first day of the Bucharest summit, Europe folded its hand and it hasn't been independent ever since. Merkel said, okay, we'll go along with this. NATO enlargement was committed. Europe has lost its voice ever since that day. Actually, German chancellors are one more pathetic than the next. Merz is now an open warmonger, completely unpopular, plummeting popularity because the public does not want this. Parties like AfD, which are called extremist right-wing parties, are actually parties that say we don't want World War III. This is all through Europe. The so-called extreme right is not the militarist right, it's the opposite. The mainstream is the militarist faction now because it fell into line with the U.S. neocons and lost its independence. European Union leaders became vassals of the United States after 2008. Who does Ursula von der Leyen work for? Clearly the United States, not for Europe. She just exposed this again in this unbelievably ridiculous so-called trade agreement where Europe gave everything to the United States, even though Europe is a bigger region, 450 million people compared to 335 million in the United States. But Europe said, we hold no cards. We can't negotiate. We fold our hand. We give everything to the United States. And that's von der Leyen. So, all of this is to say, Glenn, that Europe lost its way. It lost its independence. It lost its clarity. And one of the things that happened, just to add, is that Europe became, in its rhetoric, partly guided by the U.S. deep state, uh, insanely Russophobic. Insanely Russophobic to the point that it cannot think straight, honestly, for one moment about how we came to this war in Ukraine, how we could get out of it. If you try to say something honest about it, such as NATO enlargement, such as the West dissing and dumping the Minsk agreements, such as the U.S. refusing to limit its deployment of anti-ballistic missile systems on Russia's borders. If you say anything like that, oh, you're a Putin apologist, because that became the rhetoric of European vassal politics to the U.S. deep state. It's very sad, but Europe lost its independence, and the trade agreement is the most vivid display of that. This is not an agreement between two major powers. This is an agreement between the United States and a vassal region.
It's ironic that in today's political landscape, only the so-called far left and far right still talk about peace. Meanwhile, what dominates is a radical center. But it seems to be a center driven by warmongering, not diplomacy.
Said earlier this year, and in fact, in a speech in the European Parliament, get your act together. The U.S. is a threat to you. Understand this. Your Russophobia is backing you into a corner. Oh, Mr. Sachs, this is propaganda. This is ridiculous. It plays out exactly that way, and they don't seem to understand this. And one of the things about diplomacy, it's a very basic point. It's diplomacy 101, or even before that. You talk to the other side to understand it, to try to even understand your own situation. Europe doesn't talk to Russia, doesn't have the most basic diplomacy, stirs Russophobia. If you talk to Russia, you're an appeaser, it's ridiculous. And this just backs Europe more and more into this pathetic state of affairs where it's fearful of everybody, and its great ally, the United States, is coming to grab every piece it can and demand you buy our gas 6 times more expensive than Russia's. We're going to take Greenland from you. Just wait. Let's see Ursula von der Leyen say, yeah, they only took Greenland. They didn't take all of Denmark. It was the best deal we could get. You can already imagine the words from Ursula von der Leyen in this way.
What Professor Sachs outlined is a clear warning. The world is drifting toward disaster, driven by arrogance, failed diplomacy, and blind escalation. When both Bannon and Pope Francis suggest World War III may have already begun, it's time to pay attention. If we keep replacing diplomacy with ultimatums and silencing calls for peace, history may soon repeat itself, with devastating consequences. Draw your own conclusions. We'll be watching how the situation unfolds. Thanks for watching. This was W Report.